one of the hottest topics and the most important topics in economics today is the question of fiscal stimulus. To what degree is it effective? What are the constraints on that effectiveness? A very deep issue both in the US and in Europe right now. And we have some stellar academics here to share their papers. Whoever, if you have your brochure here, I think it was probably Rob Johnson that wrote this introduction to the panel, and I think it's quite apropos. He says that arguments are often heated and related to underlying political philosophies about the role of government in society rather than policy's actual impact in the short, medium, and long run. So this is really an issue where we need the skills of the economist to tell us when and where the fiscal stimulus will be appropriate, and we feel like we are in many ways battling a lot of traditional received or backlash thinking in order to be able to make a understanding. So we're starting a little bit late, so because we're starting late, we're going to constrain each person to about 15 minutes, and then afterwards that will give everybody a time for discussion, because I'm sure there will be a lot of interesting questions, and I have some as well at the end. All right, so our first speaker will be Professor Giancarlo Corsetti of Cambridge.
So the question is, yes, sure. Yeah. The question is how. And I have to confess that I've been working on this question since many, many years. Before the crisis, actually. I was lucky enough to be brought by students into this question. And the point is that if you look at most of the empirical studies, very serious empirical studies, the answer is actually, it may depend on circumstances, but the facts are small. Okay? So this is a typical thing that you get from time series. If you can read those, you see the line, you just look at where the line starts on the axis. You know, output 50 cents to the dollar spent, consumption nothing, investment is crowd out. So like the point is, I want to make is that if we rely on this empirical literature, no stimulus should have been done. Well, at least the stimulus should have been done with a lot of skepticism about that. But on the other hand, today, there will be no problem with consolidation. I mean, peanuts, you know, not big deal. We can bring down the debt without paying. The point is that it's not that these studies are wrong, but the question is, are they informative? And the point is that, you know, when you take these studies, they sort of go as a bulldozer, taking averages of economies across time and across economies. So there is an average of everything, an average of times in which fiscal stimulus may expect it to be reasonably actually not very powerful. So we know that the effects depends on monetary policy, a change rate regime. We have studied the Mandel-Fleming. Depends on underemployment. And here, actually, expected persistence matters a lot. Depends on the health of the banking and financial system. Depends on credibility of fiscal policy, fiscal stress, how budget is adjusted. Depends whether it's expansion versus contraction, openness, blah, blah. So how do we go? Finding the effect of fiscal stimulus is difficult in the first place. How do we go to have studies disentangling this thing? And I've been doing a lot of stuff. You may, in this country, there was a huge article about my study on the mafia. I even went into mafia multipliers to get... and I mentioned this because I don't talk about the mafia here, but I discovered actually openness may be overstated. This idea that openness is a constraint on stimulus or a constraint on contraction, with my mafia study looking at very small regions, maybe not. We need to think more. So the point is, there is no such thing as the multiplier. The multiplier is not a number, it's not a parameter, it's something that comes out of the economy. And this thing has been studied, of course, before by people. As you see, the dates are very recent because this is a topic that has become hotter over time. So I want just to show you 3 or 4 things I did with
You'll see an increasing number of German co-authors here. So at one point I will have to pay some due to their view that on these results sometimes is different from mine. So I want to show you multiplier of government spending in OECD countries, in which we try to disentangle flexible exchange rates, peg and currency union from flexible exchange rate, banking and financial crisis for time of no crisis. The paper will be out as an IMF working paper. The reason why I'm not circulating is that I don't have the green light yet, but it will come very soon. So at one point I will post it in the website. So this is an economy that is doing very well. You know, close to full employment, floating rates, no crisis. What is the multiplier? Maybe, you know, if you put confidence interval around it, basically nothing. And that's reasonable. This is an economy with fixed rate, but again, no crisis, no period of. So again, no big difference except for the real exchange rate itself. For the rest, a little bit more output, but except for the exchange rate itself, there is no much going on there. And this should not come as a surprise, because what is really key here is the different monetary and fiscal interaction. And in the sample we have, which is OECD countries through the 70s and the 80s, so the time of the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism in Europe, many of these countries were struggling with credibility issues. So whenever government spending was going up, that the interest rate would be raised to defend the currency. No? So at the end of the day, you know, there is not much difference. This is a little bit something to keep in mind for the European Union, but also to keep in mind as if those of you are lovers of the textbook version of Mandel Fleming saying that fiscal policy is more effective under a peg, think again, read Norbush 1980, or recent work of mine. It's a good time to think a little bit better. But let's come to business. This is the effect, the blue line, the baseline, the red line, the effect of economies in a crisis, according to the dates by Rogoff, Reiner, and other. Actually, we use different dating because many people criticize their calendar. As you see, all of a sudden, this multiplier become much larger. Now, all this identification is controversial. This paper will be discussed next week in Copenhagen. I'm sure there will be lots of criticism. But we try really hard robustness to see whether it wipes away, and it stays. It stays across a large number of robustness exercises. And so to me, this is like raise a question, which is in time of banking and financial crisis, the effect of fiscal policy is much stronger. Now, I just want to remind you that this is the policy model in the pre-2007 time, in which when a country was in crisis, the consensus was cut spending, and that's what we find. Spending is systematically cut, actually, in these episodes, and increase interest rate. And this is exactly what we find also in the interest rate. So this is a sort of a slightly different world from what we have today. But what this world tells me is that there is still a very strong effect from spending. So here, the world is, you know, there is a beautiful landscape out there. There is almost nothing. The models that is most successful for multiplier, the Cristiano zero lower bound, Cristiano Rebello, is not a model of crisis. It's a model of zero lower bound. There is nothing financially, there is no financial problem there. In any case, you know, we don't have a zero lower bound in the sample. So we are not picking up that. There are beautiful new papers working on, this is like Pontus Rendal is a young colleague in Cambridge, who wrote a paper about hysteresis in the labor market as a way in which there is a vicious circle from an unemployment crisis to expectation of future unemployment, and that can be cut when spending by the government intervenes. And he came out at the same time as Brad DeLong and Larry Summers' paper on essentially the same thing. The two papers sort of talk to each other. The same hysteresis, but I haven't seen it, could be done in financial market. There is my reading of Joe Stiglitz's discussion that we had at a distance in 1998, 1997, talking about the crisis in Asia, which is, if you cut spending in a crisis, you basically cut the cash flow to firms that can be used as collateral in banking, which means there is a substantial deterioration in access to credit. So these two terms, I haven't seen papers on that. Actually, I should stop everything else and work on this, but there is this idea that, there is an idea that there, a model of crisis which talks to policy is still to be written. What? I don't have much time, but I need to, what? Okay, so we eat 5 minutes. So this is what bothers me, in the sense that I think we may be close to more sound empirical studies and a better articulated theoretical work. This is a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit the ugly beast, which is, what is the multiplier when there is sovereign risk, when markets price sovereign risk? And what is the relation between these two? So many people in the past had used the stock of debt and deficit as a proxy for fiscal stress, but the proxy is very bad. Think Japan, right? Just to make a joke. And actually, I'm not able to do the same result that Perotti, Ilseski, and Mendoza and Beck. They find a different multiplier. I don't find there much of a discriminating abilities through the deficit. So what happened when the sovereign risk genie is out of the bottle? Just to quote, I don't know, is it Rogoff or Rubini? They always talk about the genie. So what about the sovereign risk genie out of the bottle? What is the multiplier in a debt crisis? Okay? We know that the concern there is confidence crisis. The fundamental weakness and confidence crisis are together. But there is more. And let me just tell you a small story. Here is a picture of the correlation between sovereign risk and private risk for non-financial corporates, large non-financial corporates. You might think that being in Europe, those are European countries, a multinational being in Italy or in Spain would be not that much affected by sovereign risk in the country. But jurisdiction risk is very strong here. And you see that the correlation actually is very strong for the countries that have the largest, the highest sovereign risk. So causation can go either way. The sovereign is in crisis because banks are ailing, or maybe the private sector is in a crisis because there is spillover from. And what I would like to do now is to walk you through the possibility of what we call the sovereign risk channel, the idea that you have a spillover from the sovereign risk to the private risk. Okay? So it's, again, another IMF working paper. This is out, also CPR, in January. And I had one German to my team, so Kik Huster is great. Kik Huster, Gernot Müller, and Andre Meyer. And we do the exercise of taking a very simple model of macro model. Don't look at the algebra, just look at the title. Like you have a Phillips curve, aggregate demand, Taylor rule. You put this idea that sovereign risk can get into private risk, and you just add a term here, a term that says that, of course, borrowing costs go up when the market, looking at deficit, debt, and other stuff, prices sovereign risk. And of course, the interest rate may react to that. We don't know, there are many political and technical constraints reacting to that, but it could also be that you are at the zero lower bound or very low interest rates, or you are in a currency union, so you cannot react. Okay, so we run the model, and this is what we get. We get at least two very unpleasant implications. So remember, this is what I'm going to show you is an upfront spending cuts, not a delay. Delayed present cuts would be wonderful, but if you do an upfront spending cuts with the policy rates that does not react to the sovereign risk in a zero lower bound, if you want. Okay? So the first result is this self-fulfilling crisis that go through lack of determinacy in the model. And they go through the real economy. So I'm sitting in Italy, I think Italy is doomed. And I project a fall in output, a fall in tax revenue, an increase in deficit. And that fits back through the sovereign risk to my private borrowing cost. Because there is a spillover between the price of government bonds and how much banks charge me. Now, clearly, when you look at this feedback effect, people may say, look, procyclical budget cuts actually may be good, because if people expect that I counteract a recession with a cut in spending, that's good. You sort of interrupt this higher sovereign risk, It's not my favorite. It's definitely like many people read this paper like that. It's not my favorite interpretation, especially because this procyclical cut in spending is very ineffective. It's not a guarantee of anything. This is still like a classical self-fulfilling confidence crisis where you need liquidity intervention. But the question there is open. It's definitely true that a strong anti-cyclical cut in spending, increase in spending in a recession without liquidity support would be disastrous here. And that's an issue. The second issue is the fact that even if we eliminate multiplicity and we go to one equilibrium, these multipliers are extremely sensitive to the state of the economy. Okay, let me walk you through a small graph, and this is the last slide. So those are like a graph of the deficit, output, and spread, depending on the expected duration of the recession that goes from here to here. Those are like, expected duration of recession. Of course, a simple model, I could say 8 quarters, but it's simply an exercise. And this is the increasing sensitivity of the risk premium to the debt and deficit. So you see that in this area, the multiplier is slightly lower because there is the confidence fairy there. So I cut spending, I have an effect on deficit. The deficit lower, so the confidence, there is a boosting in confidence. So the multiplier is actually pretty small, below 1. When we go for, when the expectation of the recessions, the expectations of the recession start to be for a long recession, then you have this weird aspect of the model with all the caveats, like in this model, so this is linearization, all the caveats you want. What I take out from here is that you can have, along this ridge, you can have either an Alesina moment, so you cut and actually the deficit goes down. Sorry, the deficit goes down because the contraction is actually expansionary. But very close to it, you have the self-defeating austerity. Okay? So,
sorry, and what determines whether you're on one universe?
Oh, it's simply the interaction between expectation of how long. So in this model, there is still no financial crisis really model. So the financial markets, intertemporal price of consumption and investment still drives everything. So there are expectations game. So it's really how pessimistic you are about the length of the recession. No? Sometimes the cut is great. Sometimes the cut comes, he doesn't bring you there. You're too far. So to me, it's a little bit the time of tasting the humble pie, which is to say the business of assessing multiplier today is extremely. I mean, I wish I was as sure as other people are about in different countries, because the other aspect is that there are extreme cases in which it's pretty clear, other cases in which may be much more complicated. I wish I could be sure about a sound assessment. We have, just let me do a small thing, I just launched a debate in Voxeo called Has Austerity Gone Too Far?, in which there's been already a reaction by Alesina, a reaction by DeLong, a reaction by Cottarelli, a reaction by Manfred Neumann. And actually, you're most welcome if you want to join the debate. Because my point was to have a little bit of out of the emotional discussion of this thing. And I can tell you from the first few reactions, the out of the emotional debate is not there. Thank you very much. I should stop there.